Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Warren Barnes and Brian Cohee? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoy this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Warren Barnes was born on May 19, 1951, and lived in Colorado. He was from a large family. At some point, he married and had a daughter. Warren eventually lived alone in Grand Junction and told people that he had once been a cowboy in the Book Cliff Mountains. He experienced difficulty regulating his intake of alcohol and struggled with housing. Despite this, Warren told people that he was not homeless. He would never ask for anything, was described as quiet and gentle, and did not mingle with the homeless population. By 2021, Warren had a job and rented a room in the area. Among other types of jobs, he performed roofing and drywall work. His intense interest in reading earned him the nickname, the Reading Man. Unfortunately, Warren would have a tragic encounter with a disturbed young man. Brian Cohee was born in 2002 and lived in Grand Junction, Colorado. His father was also named Brian. He was a carpenter and lived in a separate home. Brian lived with his mother, Terry, who operated a daycare out of her house called Terry's Toddlers. As far as employment, Brian worked part-time at a Safeway store where he bagged groceries. Mental health symptoms troubled Brian for many years. He had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD, and major depressive disorder. His intense interest in serial killers, violence, and failed attempts at dark humor attracted a lot of negative attention. Teachers indicated that Brian was at a high risk of committing a violent crime and that he needed more mental health treatment. In December 2018, Brian was arrested on assault charges after allegedly attacking a student at a bus stop. In January of 2019, he was suspended for causing panic in another student. The next month, he found himself in trouble at school for making inappropriate comments about sex. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On Sunday, February 28, 2021, 19-year-old Brian Cohee ended up with his green Ford 500 sedan being stuck in the Colorado River at 2 a.m. His vehicle was near the Blue Heron boat ramp. Both his parents and a few police officers arrived to render assistance. Eventually, the police were able to contact a towing company to pull the vehicle out of the river. Brian's story was that he had parked on the boat ramp to spend some time thinking. When he tried to pull away, his vehicle ended up in the river. The officers were satisfied that this was just a careless mistake on the part of Brian, although they were curious about blood they found on the rear bumper of his vehicle, believing that Brian had injured himself. By the time they discovered the blood, Brian was already home. When his mother called him, he told her that he had not been injured. Brian explained how he had fake blood in the trunk that he used for theater. The police decided not to investigate further. On the next day, Monday, March 1, Brian's father found a wallet belonging to 69-year-old Warren Barnes in Brian's car. He was cleaning it out because the vehicle was going to be salvaged from being in the water. Brian's father noticed information in the wallet connecting Warren to a temporary work service, so he called the service hoping this would facilitate the return of the wallet. This eventually led an acquaintance of Warren to call the police and report him missing. The same day, March 1, Brian's mother Terry called 911 and told the operator she found a human head in a plastic bag in Brian's closet at the residence they shared. The police responded to Terry's house and confronted Brian outside. An officer said to him, quote, "Your parents have concerns over some stuff they may have found in your room. What would that be?" unquote. Brian replied, quote, "Yeah, I believe so. A human head and hands from that fella that went missing. I murdered him with a knife," unquote. Brian was taken into custody, mostly because of the murder part. The police were able to confirm that the head in the plastic bag belonged to Warren Barnes. At the police station, Brian spoke to officers. Here is the story that he provided them. Late on February 27, 2021, he drove around in his vehicle while in the possession of a 12-inch knife, a bat, a mask, and 3 pairs of gloves. The mask was based on the character Michael Myers from the Halloween movies. Brian was also wearing blue coveralls consistent with that character's attire. Near the Grand Avenue footbridge on Crosby Avenue, Brian saw Warren Barnes sleeping outside. He approached him with a knife and stabbed him 30 to 40 times. During the stabbing, Warren asked Brian for the reason behind the attack. Brian responded, quote, "I have wanted to do this for a long time," unquote. After the murder, Brian took 5 photographs of Warren with his phone, but quickly deleted them. Brian cut off Warren's head and hands and left the scene, only to return later and put Warren's body in his trunk. He did this because he was worried he'd left a fingerprint behind after noticing a hole in his gloves. Brian drove to the Blue Heron boat ramp and dumped Warren's body in the Colorado River. Backing up too far is what caused Brian to get stuck. He explained how he had been driving around at night for the previous 6 months, looking at homeless camps, trying to find a victim who he thought the police would not care about. According to Brian, the murder was surprisingly easy, and he was excited while he was stabbing his victim. Brian was charged with first-degree murder and a few other offenses. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. His trial started in January 2023. Brian was found guilty of first-degree murder, 2 counts of tampering with a deceased human body, and 1 count of tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 13.5 years. This was much different than what Brian expected. He thought that he would be in prison for 15 years. I guess in one sense he was right. He will be in prison for several periods of 15 years. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts on a few areas that stood out to me in this case. Item number 1. Brian had a long history of disturbing behavior that attracted negative attention. As I mentioned, his teachers thought that he would commit a violent crime someday. They were not surprised when he was arrested for murder. Brian's mother indicated that he had a fascination with the morbid, but she hoped that he would channel it into becoming a crime scene investigator. She attempted to encourage him in that direction, but was clearly unsuccessful. Brian's friends and others who knew him talked about how he attempted to use dark humor. His statements about death and violence shocked people, but were not actually funny. He was missing the humor component of dark humor. Item number 2. Brian demonstrated extensive efforts to plan his crime and to escape responsibility. Here are just a few examples. Brian had once assembled a kit containing a hammer, a shovel, a saw, duct tape, and zip ties. His parents forced him to throw it away. He told the police his plan was to attack a sex worker. Brian drove around for months looking for potential victims. In February 2021, he made several internet searches that could indicate planning. For example, he wanted to know about holding people at knife point, how deadly a neck stab wound would be, and where homeless people sleep in the winter. Brian had a long history of other disturbing searches involving a pickaxe and knocking people out, and researched many different people who committed homicide, like notorious serial killers. Late on February 27, the day of the murder, Brian used his phone to navigate to Crosby Avenue. At 11:06 p.m., he visited a website for an organic waste disposal service. During the murder, he wore gloves and a disguise, which shows that he was trying to avoid leaving evidence behind. On March 1, at 12:23 a.m., Brian searched for how to wipe data from an Android phone. At 2:41 a.m., he searched for whether or not a river could wash away evidence. And at 6:16 a.m., he searched for the term, "How long does it take a body to stink?" After the murder, Brian attempted to dispose of the body parts of his victim. Item number 3. Brian pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, which triggered a familiar court battle between mental health clinicians. Predictably, there was a difference of opinion between clinicians for the state and those for the defense. A prosecution expert said that Brian was not suffering from a mental disorder when he murdered Warren. She claimed that he had ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, and antisocial personality disorder. Already there appears to be a major problem with her diagnosis. While it's possible that ADHD could have a rapid onset, autism spectrum disorder and antisocial personality disorder would not. These disorders are conceptualized as long-standing. For example, one requirement for antisocial personality disorder is the presence of conduct disorder symptoms before the age of 15. After claiming that Brian was not psychotic, the clinician said that Brian's delusions were based on feelings. It sounds like the clinician is admitting that Brian was delusional, which of course means he was psychotic. Furthermore, what does the phrase based on feelings mean? Beliefs and feelings are separate constructs. The question to answer would have been, was Brian delusional or not? A clinician for the defense argued that Brian had ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, and major depressive disorder. He stated there were no symptoms of conduct disorder before the age of 15, so antisocial personality disorder was ruled out. As far as the extensive planning that Brian demonstrated, the clinician argued that Brian was simply conducting research, which is different than planning. The clinician's theory of the murder was that Brian's symptoms conspired against him, along with a lack of medication and pandemic-induced isolation. This confluence of symptoms contributed to Brian fixating on violence and triggered a psychotic episode. This type of conflicting testimony from mental health experts is as common as it is fruitless. Item number 4, what could have been going on with Brian's mental health and personality? There's no way to know for sure, but here is one possible theory. Brian started getting in trouble in the 9th grade, so there were symptoms of conduct disorder before the age of 15. This means he could have had antisocial personality disorder as long as he met at least 3 of these symptom criteria. One could argue that Brian was deceptive, impulsive, aggressive, irresponsible, lacked remorse, reckless, and repeatedly broke the law. Therefore, he may have met all 7 of these symptom criteria. In addition to potentially having antisocial personality pathology, Brian was self-centered, grandiose, sadistic, and excitement-seeking. His motive for murder was to obtain the best feeling in the world, because that's what he thought killing would bring to him. Brian appeared to be struggling with intrusive thoughts and paranoia for quite some time. For example, in 2021, he searched the internet for how to cope with murderous thoughts, homicidal ideation, homicidal thoughts every day, schizoid and paranoid personality disorder, avoidant personality, and extreme paranoia. He told the police that he believed he was being watched by birds, people in windows, and eyes on walls and furniture. Every day, he had thoughts about violent acts like stabbing, biting, and striking people with a hammer. Even though Brian denied hallucinations, he reported that he had delusions. I think it is reasonable to believe that Brian had psychosis in addition to psychopathic and narcissistic traits. An intense level of mental health treatment was indicated in this case. Item number 5, was Brian guilty of murder, or did he qualify as not guilty by reason of insanity? Under the standard used in Colorado, to be not guilty by reason of insanity, a person must have been incapable of distinguishing right from wrong at the time of the offense. It seems clear that Brian did know the difference between right and wrong, therefore he was guilty. I think this was simply a case of someone who chose not to resist intrusive and paranoid thoughts. Unfortunately, these thoughts combined with his psychopathic and narcissistic traits and led to disaster. It was not an ideal combination of traits, almost like Brian was designed to kill. Now moving to the last item, number 6. If Brian had not been arrested, would he have become a serial killer? Let's take a look at some of the commonalities between Brian and serial killers. Brian murdered with a knife, dismembered his victim, and kept body parts at his home. He wanted notoriety, studied serial killers, had a desire to be a police officer, and enjoyed reliving his criminal behavior. In one statement made during the police interview, Brian said, "I'm quite inept with women." Most serial killers have major problems with women. He told the police that he felt like Hannibal Lecter. In high school, Brian's classmates thought he would become a serial killer, and he had the nickname Jeffrey Dahmer. 3 years before the murder, Brian killed a cat and kept the body for 3 days. A year before the murder, he found a dead groundhog and skinned it. In his calendar, Brian made an entry for the time range of February 27 at 11 p.m. to February 28 at 2 a.m. The murder occurred in this range. The entry was titled, First. I think it is reasonable to believe that Brian wanted to be a serial killer, but I doubt he could have achieved this goal. The desire to kill, which excited him, far outpaced his ability to get away with the crime. His personality characteristics were self-limiting and prevented him from getting to second. Those are my thoughts on the case of Warren Barnes and Brian Cohee. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.